What if the blueprint of your dreams, your fears, and your deepest secrets was discovered by a single man? Someone who didn't just study the mind, but journeyed into its wildest shadows and came back transformed. Tonight, you'll slip into the story of Carl Gustav Jung, the haunted child who saw visions in the Swiss twilight, the young doctor who listened to the whispers of forgotten patients, the explorer who mapped the secret chambers of the psyche and nearly lost himself in the process. Jung's life wasn't just strange, it was mythic. He spoke with his own unconscious, kept a secret book filled with visions and voices, and risked his sanity to chase truths that most of us only glimpse in dreams. He faced down the darkness within, and what he found, the collective unconscious, the shadow, the ancient symbols that shape us all, still shapes the world we live in. In these 2 hours, you'll walk with Jung through candlelit corridors and storm-lashed nights. You'll hear the echo of his footsteps in ancient ruins, the hush of his study by the lake, the thunder of ideas that changed how we see ourselves forever. This is your invitation to drift into the mind of a man who dared to ask, what if the answers to life's mysteries are hidden in our dreams? What if the stories we tell ourselves are older than civilization itself? So settle in, let the world slip away. The journey begins on a summer evening in 1875, in a quiet Swiss village, where a child is about to be born. A child destined to become the cartographer of the human soul. The story begins in a small parsonage near Lake Constance on a summer evening in 1875. You stand outside, the scent of hay in the air, listening to the clink of cowbells and the distant murmur of water. A storm has recently passed, leaving behind a washed clean feeling. The sky is streaked with the colors of sunset, pinks and purples melting into dark blue. Inside the whitewashed house, a newborn child lies wrapped in linens on a simple wooden bed. His mother, Emily, is exhausted from labor yet serene. She strokes the child's head with fingers that have scrubbed floors and kneaded bread, and whispers words that drift like smoke. She has a habit of talking to unseen visitors and believes spirits roam the halls. She calls her son Carl. His father, Paul, a pastor, stands at the doorway reading a prayer from a worn book. The corners of his mouth turn downward in concern. 2 stillborn infants preceded this child, and their absence lingers like a chill. Paul wonders if his faith will protect this new life, or whether his doubts will curse it. He feels caught between doctrine and despair. You sense that the boy between them will inherit both his father's questioning and his mother's visions. Outside, the lake catches the first stars. Carl grows quickly from a soft infant into a solemn toddler with bright eyes. He toddles through the garden, picks up stones, and tucks them into his pockets as if they are treasure. He watches his father practice sermons in a dim study lined with books, his voice low and reverent. Sometimes, mid-sentence, Paul falters, a shadow crossing his face. He worries that words alone cannot hold what he feels. In the evenings, Emily tells stories of dreams and apparitions. She once described seeing a floating head in the hallway, a featureless face hovering in the dark. The boy listens wide-eyed, half afraid and half entranced. He begins to sense there are 2 worlds, one of sunlight and chores and church, and another of whispers, shadows, and symbols. When he cannot sleep, he sits up and imagines he hears voices in the wind. He feels as if someone unseen is watching him. Instead of pushing the feeling away, he leans into it, curious. This curiosity will guide him again and again. As Carl grows older, the rhythms of his home shape him. His father visits parishioners, buries the dead, baptizes babies, and returns with stories of sorrow and joy. At dinner, Paul prays methodically. His faith seems more duty than passion. He uses words like salvation and sin, but Carl senses emptiness behind them. Emily tends to the household and drifts into periods of depression. She has moments of clarity when she bakes bread with laughter, and times when she withdraws behind a closed door, speaking to spirits. Carl watches her disappear into inner worlds, and wonders what those worlds are like. One night he wakes to find a light under his mother's door. He pushes the door open a crack and sees her standing in her nightgown, arms outstretched, speaking to something only she can see. A luminous head floats before her, separated from anybody. It glides slowly down the hall. The hair on Carl's neck rises, but he cannot look away. He senses that such visions, terrifying as they are, might point to something deep and true. When he tells his father, Paul dismisses it as a dream. But the image lodges inside the boy like a seed, and years later it will bloom into an understanding of how the unconscious speaks. School is not easy for him. He is a sensitive child with a vivid imagination. He daydreams in class, staring at dust motes, dancing in a beam of light, rather than focusing on Latin declensions. The teacher scolds him for inattentiveness and calls him lazy. One day in the schoolyard, a bigger boy shoves him to the ground. His head hits the earth, and for a moment everything goes black. After that, whenever he walks to school or tries to study, he feels faint and collapses. The doctor murmurs about epilepsy. Carl overhears his father worrying aloud that his son might never earn a living. Shame and determination surge inside him like twin flames. He drags himself to his father's study, pulls down a Latin grammar, and stumbles through declension after declension. He recites until the words blur and fainting spells cease. From this experience, he learns that symptoms carry meaning and that facing one's fear can transform it. He will later call this neurosis, but for now it's a child's refusal to give in. The attic becomes his sanctuary. It smells of dust and old wood. Sunlight filters through a small window, illuminating floating dust motes like stars. Among trunks of clothing and stacks of hymnals, he makes a discovery: a forgotten tin pencil case, a small wooden ruler left behind. He carves the end of the ruler into a tiny figure with a round head and stub arms. He paints a smooth stone he found by the lake, dividing it into halves of bright and dark. He places the doll and the stone together in the tin and wraps them in cloth. Each day he creeps up the attic ladder to kneel before this secret shrine. He writes messages on slips of paper in an invented script, tucks them under the stone, and feels as though he is communicating with a wise presence. The ritual soothes him. The attic becomes a temple, the tin case an altar. In later years, he will see parallels between his childhood game and indigenous soul stones. But for now, it is simply a boy's way of making meaning in a house where so much feels uncertain. Sometimes he takes the painted stone out and skips it across the lake. He watches the ripples widen and imagines them continuing beyond his sight, perhaps all the way to other countries. In his dreams, he walks down dark hallways into underground chambers, guided by a candle. He sees a giant phallus in a cave, grotesque and radiant, and wakes, sweating. He draws the scene in his notebook, shading the curves carefully. He does not tell anyone. He senses these images hold power that adults might scorn. He also dreams of keys and doors, of spiral staircases twisting downward. He sketches the keys, giving them ornate handles and teeth like tiny dragons. These dreams are unsettling but also magnetic. He senses they come from the same place his mother sees in her visions. While other children play outside, He collects shells and fossils, turning them over in his palms and wondering about time. He asks his father about fossils, and Paul answers with stories from Genesis. Carl thinks there must be more. He begins to suspect that the earth holds memories older than the Bible. His fascination with ancient tales grows. He discovers Greek myths, Norse sagas, and medieval legends. He reads about gods who shapeshift, about heroes who descend into the underworld and return transformed. He learns about Theseus navigating the labyrinth with Ariadne's thread. He copies stories of Orpheus traveling to Hades, and notes that these tales mirror something inside him. They seem to describe psychological realities, rather than mere adventures. When his teacher dismisses mythology as pagan nonsense, Carl feels a flicker of rebellion. He begins to draw labyrinths in the margins of his exercise books, single lines coiling inward. He writes fables, in which stones speak, and rivers give advice. He senses that imagination is not an escape, but a tool, like a lantern in a cave. In adolescence, he wishes to study archaeology. The idea of digging into the earth to uncover artifacts appeals to him. But finances are tight. His father, now ill and struggling with money, cannot afford to send him to far-off excavations. Relatives step in to help him attend the University of Basel, closer to home. He will study medicine. The decision is both practical and symbolic. Medicine combines the tangible world of the body with the intangible realm of suffering. On the day he leaves, he climbs to the attic, touches his little doll and stone, and writes them a farewell note. He promises to return. As he descends the ladder, he pauses and listens to the house. The creak of timbers, the distant call of birds. He carries the tin case with him, hidden in his satchel. He steps onto a wagon and rides away toward a future he cannot yet imagine, feeling both excitement and sorrow. The lake glints behind him, a mirror of his childhood, as he begins the next chapter. The University of Basel sits beside the Rhine River in a city bustling with students, merchants, and scholars. Carl arrives with a satchel of books, his painted stone, and his carved doll hidden among shirts. The dormitory smells of damp stone and ink. He attends lectures in anatomy, the air thick with the scent of formaldehyde. He watches as professors dissect corpses, revealing muscles and organs. He is fascinated by the body, but senses that a person is more than flesh. At night he reads philosophy. He copies Plato's dialogues and feels the tug of questions about being and knowing. He reads about the natural sciences and wonders how fossils form. The Rhine's water flows steadily outside his window, and he imagines that his life, like the river, is part of a larger current. In the evenings he walks through Basel's narrow streets, past bakeries and taverns. He hears voices speaking Swiss German, French, and Latin. He attends lectures in theology and psychology, two fields that seem opposed yet are both concerned with the soul. He begins to keep a dream diary. He records images of caves, keys, old men in robes, and labyrinthine staircases. He notices recurring motifs, spirals, stones, and water. He senses that dreams are not random. They speak in a language of images. This realization thrills him. He also writes letters home, telling his sister about his classes and his mother about the river. He writes, "I think there is something inside us that is older than our names." During his second year, his father dies. The news arrives by letter. Carl feels the world tilt. He returns home for the funeral, standing by the grave as the first snow falls. He watches his father's coffin lowered into the earth. He feels sadness and a strange sense of liberation. Paul was both a guide and a source of unspoken tension. His doubts weighed on Carl like invisible stones. Now those stones seem to have been lifted and set down. He returns to Basel with renewed resolve. He decides to pursue psychiatry, drawn by its promise to study the mind. He tells himself that understanding the psyche is like unearthing fossils, delicate work requiring patience and reverence. With this decision, the path leads him to the Burgosli Hospital in Zurich. The Burgosli is a sprawling institution set on a hillside overlooking Zurich. Patients wander its courtyards and corridors like ghosts from their own stories. The buildings are gray. The hallways echo with murmurs and moans. Carl arrives as an assistant to Eugen Bleuler, a physician pioneering treatments for schizophrenia. He is assigned to observe patients, to listen. At first, the experience is overwhelming. People talk to unseen figures, laugh at nothing, and tremble with fear. He hears one patient whisper about snakes under his skin, another say she is possessed by a demon. Instead of dismissing their words as nonsense, Carl leans in. He listens as he listened to his mother's stories. He senses that their delusions are symbolic, that their minds are trying to communicate something. He conducts word association experiments, dropping simple words like mother, house, knife, and measuring how long it takes patients to respond. Patterns emerge. He sees that certain words trigger hidden complexes. He writes up his findings and feels a spark of discovery. During this time, he meets Emma Rauschenbach, a woman from a wealthy family with a sharp mind and gentle eyes. She visits the hospital to volunteer, bringing fruit baskets and knitting scarves. Carl is drawn to her curiosity and calm. They walk together along the lake, talking about books and dreams. Emma has a practical grounding presence that balances Carl's intensity. He tells her about the tin case in his attic and his fascination with myths. She smiles, listening without judgment. They marry, and Emma brings stability and resources. Her family's money allows Carl to pursue research without immediate financial worry. Together they build a home in Küsnacht. Children are born. The house fills with laughter and chaos. Emma supports his work, even when it takes him away physically or mentally. She becomes a partner in his journey, both anchor and ally. Carl's work at Burgosli intensifies. He publishes on the word association test and the concept of complexes. He sends copies of his papers to Sigmund Freud, a Viennese neurologist whose interpretation of dreams has impressed him. Freud writes back. Their correspondence is lively, full of questions about the unconscious and the nature of neurosis. They arrange to meet. Carl travels to Vienna, sits in Freud's dark book-lined study, and talks with him for 13 hours. They click like long-lost relatives. Freud sees Carl as his crown prince, an heir to psychoanalysis. For a time, Carl feels that he has found an intellectual father. Their ideas complement each other. Freud emphasizes sexual drives, and Carl points to other sources of psychic energy. They travel together to America, lecturing at Clark University. On the ship crossing the Atlantic, they stand on deck, watching waves and talking about dreams. The sea stretches out like the unconscious itself, deep, unfathomable, full of hidden life. Yet even in these early days, differences appear. Freud insists that religion is an illusion born of childhood helplessness. Carl feels religion can be a source of meaning, a repository of ancient symbols. Freud downplays myths. Carl embraces them. Freud sees the unconscious as a cesspool of repressed impulses. Carl sees it as a storehouse of creative potential. These divergences simmer beneath their friendship like coals under ash. When Freud falls ill on the voyage and Carl expresses sympathy, Freud whispers, "Promise me you will never abandon the sexual theory." Carl hesitates, murmurs something vague. A fissure opens. Back in Europe it will widen until it becomes a chasm. But for now there is still camaraderie. They tour universities, share ideas, and laugh over dinner. Carl, however, keeps writing in his notebook about dreams and myths, suspecting that his path is leading elsewhere. The inevitable divide comes slowly and painfully. Carl publishes a book that becomes Symbols of Transformation, arguing that libidinal energy is not purely sexual, but a general psychic energy that can be expressed in spiritual and creative ways. He asserts that myths from around the world describe similar patterns: journeys into darkness, deaths and rebirths, unions of opposites. Freud reacts with alarm and anger. Letters fly back and forth. The tone turns from affectionate to accusatory. Freud accuses Carl of mysticism. Carl accuses Freud of dogmatism. The psychoanalytic community splits. At a meeting of the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society, tensions are palpable. Carl feels isolated, as if he has been expelled from a family. The break leaves him untethered. He resigns from the International Psychoanalytical Association. He feels grief and liberation simultaneously, much like when his father died. He plunges into a period of solitude and introspection. He will soon begin the most important journey of his life, into his own depths. Imagine candlelit libraries lined with dark wooden shelves. It is the early 20th century, and Zurich is a city of cobbled streets and gas lamps. You walk beside Carl as he returns to his study, his footsteps echoing. A storm is brewing outside, wind battering shutters, rain tapping a steady rhythm on the panes. He lights a lamp and unrolls parchment, the flame casting moving shadows on the walls. His mind is full after a day of lecturing on anatomy and sitting with patients. He reads late into the night, pulling down volumes on alchemy, medieval mysticism, and comparative mythology. He highlights passages that speak of prima materia and transmutation. He jots notes in the margins about the parallel between turning lead into gold and transforming base instincts into higher consciousness. Emma knocks softly, bringing tea. She sits with him, knitting, listening to him read aloud. The fire crackles. He muses that perhaps the images in old texts are not mere superstition, but coded descriptions of psychological processes. The idea excites him. He feels something stir, a new vision of psychology as the study of the soul in all its historical manifestations. During the day, he divides his time between the university and the hospital. He teaches students about the nervous system, demonstrating with models of the brain. He supervises experiments in the psychology lab, still using the word association test. He invites colleagues over to discuss cases. He walks through wards where patients rock and mutter, pausing to greet individuals by name. He sits with them and asks about their dreams. Some describe being chased by animals. Others speak of crossing bridges or climbing mountains. He listens closely, feeling that each symbol is a clue to inner reality. He tries to see beyond the symptoms to the person inside. Many of his superiors are skeptical. They want measurable results, not stories. He persists, believing that stories matter. He begins writing papers that weave clinical observations with mythological allusions. His reputation grows as both scientist and storyteller. At night, he climbs a hill above his house. The wind whips at his coat, and the city lights shimmer below. He looks up at the sky, at stars that his ancestors also gazed upon, and feels small and huge simultaneously. He thinks about his father and grandfather. He remembers the tin box in the attic. He resolves to trust his inner compass even when it leads him away from established paths. He whispers to the night, "I am ready to follow where the images lead." The clouds part, revealing a bright, almost full moon. Its light is cold but clear. He feels as if the moon listens and approves. He returns to his study, with a renewed commitment to explore the depths of the human psyche. He knows the path will not be easy, but he senses that truth often lies in the dark. He has always been drawn to shadows. In the wards of the Burgoldsli, Carl begins to apply his developing ideas. He sits with a young woman who believes she is possessed by a snake. She feels something slithering under her skin, coiling around her heart. She is terrified of the dark and refuses to eat. Other doctors shrug and prescribe sedatives. Carl asks her to draw the snake. She sketches a long, sinuous form with fangs and eyes. As she draws, she begins to relax. He asks her if the snake speaks. She nods, tears in her eyes, and whispers that it tells her not to trust anyone. He gently invites her to have a conversation with the snake. Over weeks, the snake becomes less monstrous and more like a protective figure. He interprets the snake as a symbol of transformation, akin to the serpent in alchemy that eats its tail. The woman's symptoms lessen. Carl documents the process in his notes. He begins to see that asking patients about their images can transform their relationship to their symptoms. He conducts a similar exercise with a soldier returned from war who is haunted by nightmares. The soldier dreams of being trapped in a trench, mud filling his mouth, unable to breathe. During therapy, Carl asks him to imagine finding a way out. The soldier envisions a ladder and climbs it. At the top, he sees daylight. The nightmares become less frequent. Carl sees that guiding patients to participate in their own imagery helps. He calls this process active imagination. He writes that the unconscious is not just a dumping ground for repressed material, but a source of wisdom. His colleagues raise eyebrows, but some are intrigued. Word of his work spreads to other hospitals. He begins receiving letters from people seeking treatment, and from scholars curious about his techniques. He feels that he is on the edge of a new understanding. In his own dreams, snakes appear too, as dragons and serpents coiled around trees. He pays attention. He writes them down and compares them with myths from India and Greece. He sees that serpents often symbolize renewal. He wonders if the human mind spontaneously produces similar images across cultures. He notes that patients with no knowledge of classical myths sometimes dream of gods and monsters. The idea of a collective unconscious begins to form. He pictures a vast underground cave connecting all minds, filled with shared motifs. He has not yet named archetypes, but they loom on the edge of his awareness. He senses that he is tapping into something ancient and universal, and the thought fills him with awe. At home, life is full. The house in Kuznacht is built of stone, with a garden that slopes down to the lake. Emma tends roses and invites friends over for tea. Children run through rooms, their laughter echoing off walls, lined with books and paintings. Carl writes papers at a large desk, sometimes with a baby on his knee. He hears the voices of his family as a counterpoint to the voices of patients and the murmurs of his dreams. He loves his children fiercely. Agatha, Gret, Franz, Marianne, Helene, each with her own personality. He tells them bedtime stories about dragons and princes, about wise animals and brave girls. He does not hide his interest in mythology. When his son asks about a nightmare, Carl listens as carefully as he does to his patients. Emma watches with a smile. She has her own interests. She begins to study psychology, eventually becoming a respected analyst. Their partnership deepens. It is during these years that Carl meets Tony Wolfe, a patient who becomes a collaborator and friend. Tony is brilliant, insightful, and empathetic. She becomes an analyst in her own right, and is instrumental in developing the concept of the anima and animus, the feminine and masculine principles in each person. She and Carl share a passionate intellectual connection, and, eventually, an emotional one. Carl loves both Emma and Tony. Emma knows about the relationship and chooses to accept it. It is not easy. The arrangement challenges societal norms and creates tension, but it also contributes to the richness of Carl's life and work. Tony acts as a muse and confidant. She encourages him to delve deeper into his imagination. Emma provides grounding and stability. Between them, he navigates a complex web of affection and loyalty. He sees that life is not simple, and that truth often involves embracing contradictions. Later he will write about the union of opposites as a path to wholeness. He is living it. Carl and Sigmund Freud's relationship enters its golden era. They exchange long letters in which they discuss dreams, symbolism, and therapy. They meet in cafes and lecture halls, their conversations moving from the personal to the theoretical. Carl visits Vienna, attending meetings with Freud's circle. The room is thick, with cigar smoke and heated debate. They discuss cases of hysteria and obsession, analyzing each symptom through the lens of sexual repression. Carl listens, nodding, but his mind drifts toward images of heroes and gods. He raises the possibility that not all neuroses stem from repressed sexuality, that perhaps some come from a conflict between conscious and unconscious values. Freud listens politely but moves the conversation back to his theory. Carl feels a slight distance open, but at this stage he keeps most of his reservations to himself. Freud invites Carl to join him on the trip to Clark University in the United States. They travel across the Atlantic on a steamship. The ocean is vast, its horizon merging with the sky. Nights on deck are filled with stars and the steady thrum of engines. Freud and Carl pace together, discussing the future of psychoanalysis. In America, they are welcomed like celebrities. They lecture on psychoanalysis to fascinated audiences. They meet William James, who is curious about their work. They visit Niagara Falls, standing near the cascading water, talking about the power of nature and the mind. For a moment, their differences seem small in the face of such majesty. Carl feels grateful for Freud's mentorship and friendship. He senses that history is being made, and that he is part of it. But he also feels an undercurrent. He knows that his path is beginning to diverge, and he wonders how to honor his own truth without betraying his friend. The trip expands Carl's horizons. He sees the modern bustle of American cities, the energy of students, the diversity of cultures. He thinks about how psychological theories developed in Europe might apply differently in America. He notes that people seem more optimistic, less bound by tradition. He wonders if the psyche expresses itself differently in different societies. He writes notes about indigenous peoples he hopes to visit one day. He considers the possibility that the collective unconscious may have layers, some universal, some culture-specific. He scribbles these thoughts in his notebook, hoping to revisit them later. For now, he returns to Europe with Freud, carrying both inspiration and an unspoken weight. The strain between Freud and Carl becomes more pronounced once they return to Europe. They exchange letters that begin to bristle. Freud hears rumors that Carl is exploring occult topics. He writes cautioning him. Carl replies that exploring the irrational is necessary to understand the psyche fully. Freud counters that psychoanalysis must remain scientific. Privately, Carl is reading alchemical texts and writing about myth. Publicly, he continues to chair the International Psychoanalytical Association. He senses eyes watching him, waiting for him to slip. At meetings, he feels the weight of being the only non-Jew in Freud's inner circle. He feels misunderstood, and his colleagues suspect he may betray them. The tension gnaws at him like a toothache. He writes that he feels like a crown prince in a system he no longer believes in. One afternoon in 1912, during a psychoanalytic congress, a polite conversation turns into confrontation. Freud insists that every symbol leads back to sexuality. Carl cites examples from his patients that do not fit this pattern. Freud calls him a heretic. Carl calls Freud dogmatic. The room goes silent. Later, Freud writes to others saying that Carl is falling into psychosis. Carl hears this through a friend. He is hurt. The break becomes inevitable. In an act he later calls the Kreuzlingen gesture. Freud visits a colleague in Switzerland without stopping by to see Carl. Carl takes this as a deliberate insult. In response, he resigns from the Psychoanalytic Association. He loses friends, professional networks, and mentors all at once. He feels grief and rage. He knows he must continue on his own, but the road ahead is dark. At home, Emma notices his agitation. She suggests he take a break from his duties. He agrees. He spends more time in nature, walking along the lake and through forests. He carves sticks and stones, returning to his childhood habit of making objects. He sits quietly for hours, listening to birds and to his own heartbeat. He feels something coming, like a storm building on the horizon. He writes in his diary, "I am standing at the brink of an abyss. I am called to descend." He does not know what will happen when he lets go of Freud's hand, but he senses that it is necessary. In dreams, he sees floods, rivers of blood, and towers crashing. He paints these images in his journal. He feels that the collective unconscious is not just an idea. It is alive and about to erupt through him. He gathers his courage and steps toward the edge. The descent begins quietly. Carl stops seeing most patients and resigns from the university. He focuses on his inner life. He begins a disciplined practice of active imagination. He sets aside time each day to let his mind wander, then writes down or paints whatever emerges. He treats his unconscious like a friend to be engaged, rather than a threat to be suppressed. At first, images come slowly. A shadowy figure in a cave, a woman in white by a river. He speaks to them, asks questions, listens to their answers. They respond. He is startled and comforted. He writes down their dialogues in black notebooks. The figures grow more vivid. He meets an old man, with wings and bullhorns, who introduces himself as Philemon. Philemon speaks in riddles, teaching Carl that his thoughts are not wholly his own, that ideas have agency. Carl paints Philemon in bright colors. Turquoise wings, red robes, golden eyes. He feels as if he has discovered an inner teacher. He is not alone in this journey. Toni Wolff remains by his side. She listens to his visions, offers interpretations, and encourages him to explore further. Emma watches with concern, but trusts that he knows what he is doing. Carl fears for his sanity. During a tram ride along Lake Zurich, he experiences a vision of Europe, engulfed in floodwaters and blood. He writes about it. Months later, World War I breaks out. He feels both horror and a strange sense of validation. He senses that his own inner turmoil mirrors collective chaos. He continues to paint and write, filling pages with mandalas, scenes of caves and castles, images of serpents, and dialogues with mysterious figures. He creates a large red leather journal that he calls Liber Novus, the New Book, which later becomes known simply as the Red Book. He writes in calligraphic script, adds vibrant illustrations, and treats it like scripture. He shows it to almost no one, fearing misunderstanding. He pours his soul into it, believing that what emerges will form the foundation of his future work. Carl's visions are sometimes terrifying. He dreams of corpses floating in rivers, of cities sinking, of monstrous figures tearing apart walls. He writes these dreams down faithfully, even when they make him tremble. He notices that images and narratives appear spontaneously and often connect to myths he has read. He dreams of a large black snake devouring itself and recognizes the Ouroboros. He dreams of a wounded healer and remembers the Greek centaur Chiron. He realizes that symbols live in him and in everyone. He begins to see that the psyche is not a blank slate, but an ancient structure. He names the recurring patterns, quote, archetypes. He writes essays describing the shadow, the rejected parts of the self, the anima and animus, the inner feminine and masculine in each person, and the self, the center and totality of the psyche. He feels as if he is naming forces that have always existed. He senses that his work is less invention than discovery. While he explores his own psyche, the world outside is in chaos. World War I rages. Hospitals overflow with wounded soldiers. People starve. Governments fall. The sense of collective security crumbles. Carl sees parallels between his visions and headlines. He writes that modern people have lost touch with meaning. They ignore their inner voices and thus act unconsciously, projecting their shadows onto enemies. He believes that without inner work, society repeats its own nightmares. His experience teaches him that the personal and collective unconscious are connected. If he can map his own inner world, perhaps others can too. He begins to give lectures again, cautiously sharing some of his insights. He speaks about the symbol as a mediator between conscious and unconscious. He talks about dreams as messages from the soul. He explains that therapy is not just about removing symptoms, but about integrating opposites. His ideas are met with both fascination and ridicule. Some call him a mystic, others a genius. He accepts both labels with equanimity. He continues to write in his Red Book, adding new mandalas with geometric precision. He writes about the union of opposites, the eternal dance between light and dark. He feels that he is becoming whole. He knows the journey will never truly end. As the war ends and the world begins to rebuild, Carl emerges from his inner descent. He feels older, as if he has lived several lifetimes in a few years. The Red Book is full. He sets it aside and returns to academic writing. He writes about personality types, describing the difference between introversion and extroversion. He writes about psychological functions, thinking, feeling, sensation, intuition. He publishes Psychological Types, which helps people understand their strengths and blind spots. He begins to see patients again, bringing with him a deeper empathy. He is able to accompany them into their nightmares, because he has walked through his own. He maintains his friendships with both Emma and Tony, though the dynamic has changed. He spends time with his children, who are now older and developing their own interests. He builds a house with Emma in Küsnacht, near the water. It has large windows that look out over the lake. He plants trees and watches them grow. He begins to think about building a retreat where he can work with his hands. He dreams of a tower. The dream is specific. Stones, mortar, a curved wall. He shares the idea with Emma. She supports him. He buys land further along the lake and begins to build. Each stone he lifts is heavy and grounding. As he fits them together, he feels his mind solidify too. When the basic tower is complete, he sits inside by a fire and feels at peace. He knows the journey into himself has changed him forever. He knows that the rest of his life will be about sharing what he has learned. He turns his attention outward, ready to explore the world again. Vienna remains in your mind as a place of dark wood and high ceilings, of heavy curtains and cigar smoke. You walk into a room where a group of men are gathered, chairs arranged in a circle. Carl is among them, younger than most, his eyes bright. Freud sits across from him, a cigar held between his fingers. The conversation is spirited. They discuss the nature of repression, the interpretation of dreams, the role of the analyst. When someone mentions a myth, Freud dismisses it as a fantasy. Carl shifts in his seat, feeling a tug. He wants to speak about myths as carriers of wisdom. He mentions one, and the room hums with disagreement. He swallows his objection, waits, and then explains his view, that myths are the dreams of a people, and to ignore them is to ignore part of the psyche. The group looks at him with skepticism and curiosity. He feels both exhilarated and isolated. He is still within Freud's circle, but already he stands slightly apart. During breaks, Carl walks the streets of Vienna. He notices statues of classical figures in the squares. He hears music from concert halls. He visits the Hofburg Palace and imagines the history layered beneath its stones. He thinks of his own ancestors and the stories he carries. He meets Freud for coffee in a cafe. They speak of patience. Freud tells a case of a man obsessed with order, interpreting everything through the lens of sexual development. Carl listens respectfully, but imagines the patient as an alchemist, seeking transformation. The two men are speaking different languages. Still, there is warmth. They share jokes. They talk about travel. Freud invites Carl to stay longer. Carl declines politely. He has a practice to attend to in Zurich, a family to return to. He senses that leaving Vienna will mark the beginning of the end of their friendship. After this visit, letters between them become more formal. Freud expresses concern about Carl's interest in the occult. He warns him that blending mysticism with science will discredit psychoanalysis. Carl writes back that the psyche cannot be fully understood without considering symbols, religion, and myth. He writes, "Our methods must evolve. We cannot amputate the soul to fit a theory." Freud does not answer. Carl feels a door closing. He senses that his path will lead him away from the rooms of Vienna into unknown lands. He does not regret his time there, but he knows he cannot stay. The Atlantic crossing on the ship to America is long and filled with reflection. Carl leans on the rail, watching waves rise and fall, foaming white at their crests. The sea is a deep, infinite blue. He thinks of the ocean as an image of the unconscious, vast and mysterious. He stands there for hours, letting the wind whip his hair. He senses that he is between worlds, old Europe behind him, new America ahead. On board, he and Freud continue to talk. They discuss the importance of bringing psychoanalysis to new audiences. They dream of establishing institutes and training analysts. They are excited, but subtle tensions flicker beneath the surface. When Freud speaks of bringing civilization to the masses, Carl wonders quietly whether civilization itself may be a neurosis. He keeps these thoughts to himself, not wanting to quarrel on the open sea. In Worcester, Massachusetts, they are greeted with fanfare. Lectures are well attended. Carl speaks about word association and complexes. Freud speaks about the Oedipus complex. Students ask questions. Journalists write articles. There is a sense of excitement. They are pioneers, bringing a new science to America. At a reception, a woman asks Carl about his use of myth. He answers that myths can help us understand patterns in human behavior. She nods. He feels a spark of recognition, someone who understands. He begins to imagine an audience beyond Vienna, people ready to hear about archetypes and symbols. He feels that he might find more freedom in this new world than in the old. After the lectures, they travel to New York. Carl climbs the Statue of Liberty and looks out at the harbor, full of ships. He thinks about the countless immigrants arriving in search of a new life. He wonders what psychological patterns drive migration. He writes notes about the American psyche, open, pragmatic, restless. He meets with William James, who is warm and curious. They discuss the difference between philosophy and psychology. James encourages him to continue exploring the spiritual dimension. Carl feels validated. He returns to Europe with ideas buzzing in his mind. He knows he will return to America someday, but first, he must face the storm brewing at home. Back in Zurich, Carl throws himself into work. He and Emma host seminars in their home. They invite students, thinkers, artists. They discuss dreams and myths, read from ancient texts, and analyze paintings. Carl writes about the transcendent function, the process by which conflicting elements of the psyche come together to produce a new attitude. He advocates for holding tension rather than resolving it prematurely. He presents case studies illustrating how suffering can lead to growth. His ideas attract followers and critics. He finds community among those interested in what he calls analytical psychology. The name signals both kinship with and distance from psychoanalysis. Emma encourages him. Tony offers insights, and he feels a new movement forming. During this time, Carl finishes his book that will become known as Symbols of Transformation. He delves into myths of heroes who slay dragons and rescue maidens, interpreting them as symbolic of psychological processes. He analyzes the story of the hero Siegfried and sees it as a representation of the ego's battle with unconscious forces. He writes about the rebirth motif in mythology, connecting it to personal transformation. He stresses that libido is not solely sexual, but a general life energy that can be directed toward various goals. The book is dense, richly illustrated with references from Greek, Persian, Indian, and indigenous mythologies. He knows it will challenge Freud's theory. He sends a copy to Freud. The silence that follows is heavy. He hears through a colleague that Freud feels betrayed. Carl sits by the lake, looking at the water's surface. He remembers his boyhood and the painted stone. He thinks about how far he has come. He knows the coming break will be painful, but he feels compelled to speak his truth. The water is still, reflecting the sky. A swan glides past, serene. Carl whispers, "May I have the courage to follow my path?" He skips a stone, watching ripples spread. He feels the tension of holding loyalty and authenticity. He knows he cannot keep both. The final break comes like a storm. Freud invites Carl to discuss his book in Vienna. The atmosphere is tense. They sit across from each other, the air thick. Freud accuses Carl of abandoning science. Carl defends his exploration of myth. Freud raises his voice. Carl responds with equal intensity. At one point, Freud faints. He collapses, and for a moment Carl thinks he might die. Freud revives and blames the fainting on stress. Carl feels guilty and resentful. The conversation resumes, but a crack has opened that cannot be mended. When Carl leaves Vienna, Freud says, "I cannot forgive you for abandoning the sexual theory." Carl replies, "I cannot forgive you for reducing the soul to sexuality." They part with formal goodbyes. Letters cease. Carl returns to Zurich, feeling both sorrow and relief. He has lost a mentor and friend, but he has gained his own voice. The break reverberates through the psychoanalytic world. Students take sides. Some call Carl a mystic charlatan. Others say Freud is rigid. The press runs stories. Carl feels exposed. He becomes the subject of gossip. He struggles with self-doubt. He wonders if he has thrown away a promising career for a personal vision. He turns to his dreams. They offer images of rebirth. He dreams of descending into a cave, where a snake leads him to a pool of clear water. He drinks and feels renewed. He interprets the dream as a sign to continue. He writes, "The greater the contradiction, the deeper the life." He writes letters to Emma and Tony, confessing his fears. They respond with love and support. He meets with his students, who reassure him that his ideas resonate. He attends church one Sunday, sits in the back, and listens to the hymns. He feels a connection to something larger than himself. He walks by the lake, picks up stones, and carves symbols into them. He places them in the garden as reminders of his commitment to the inner journey. He knows the world outside might judge him, but he cannot betray his inner truth. He resolves to trust the process, just as he did when he faced fainting spells as a boy. He will descend and rise again. After the break, Carl enters a period of depression. He wakes with heaviness, his chest tight. He feels as if he is walking through fog. He avoids social gatherings. He spends hours by himself, sometimes staring at the fire, sometimes walking aimlessly. He writes in his diary, "I feel lost, as though my compass has broken." He notices that his dreams are full of images of disintegration, crumbling towers, collapsing bridges, falling bodies. He fears he is losing his mind. He thinks of his mother's visions and wonders if he will end up like her, withdrawn and talking to spirits. He writes, "If I surrender to the depths, will I drown?" He reads letters from former colleagues that sting. He hears rumors that Freud has told others he is psychotic. He feels betrayed. He spends long nights sitting in his study, lit only by candles, his pen hovering over the page. One day he walks in the woods and sees a huge boulder with a crack running through it. Moss grows in the fissure. He sits on the boulder and traces the crack with his fingers. He realizes that the crack has allowed water and seeds to enter, creating a micro-ecosystem. He thinks, "Perhaps my own breaking will allow something new to grow." He goes home and writes, "The wound is the place where the light enters you." The phrase comforts him. He begins to see that depression is a dark night of the soul. Not an end, but a beginning. He resolves to record what happens to him, to use his own suffering as a source of knowledge. He begins carving small stones again, just as he did as a boy. He sits by the fire and scratches symbols into their surfaces. Circles with crosses, spirals, triangles. Each mark feels like an anchor. He places them on his desk, carrying them in his pocket. They remind him of his inner work. He writes letters to his children, telling them about his dreams without frightening them. He writes to colleagues in other disciplines, artists, poets, theologians, seeking connection outside psychoanalysis. He reads Dante's Divine Comedy and resonates with the descent into hell and the ascent to paradise. He feels accompanied by those who have walked similar paths. Slowly, his depression lifts. He begins to see color again. He paints his visions in watercolors, bright reds, deep blues. He feels life returning. He smiles more. He thanks the darkness for what it has taught him. He knows now that suffering is not to be shunned but to be understood. As Europe inches toward war, Carl's visions become apocalyptic. He dreams of rivers of blood flowing across the continent, of mountains splitting and towns sinking. He dreams of a monstrous wave engulfing cities. He sees images of destruction and hears voices speaking about the end of an era. He writes these visions down, even when they frighten him. He notes the dates. Months later, war breaks out. He is stunned at the correspondence between his inner imagery and outer events. He feels he is witnessing the eruption of collective shadow. He begins to believe that the unconscious can be prophetic. He theorizes that when individuals repress their shadows, the collective will express them, often violently. He writes essays, warning about the dangers of mass movements. He calls for inner work as a way to prevent outer catastrophe. The war affects his family. 2 of his sons serve in the Swiss army. Food is scarce. The atmosphere is tense. Carl sees wounded soldiers in his practice, men traumatized by trench warfare. They tell him about rats and shells, about comrades dying, about the smell of gas. He listens, heart heavy. He feels both compassion and anger at the senselessness of war. He writes that the madness of war is the madness of the unconscious, left unchecked. He commits himself even more deeply to understanding the psyche. He feels that he has a responsibility to share his insights, to help others avoid projecting their shadows onto enemies. He gives lectures, writes articles, and meets with priests and artists. He sees that psychology must collaborate with religion and art to heal. During these years, Toni Wolff remains a steady presence. She studies Greek and compares myths with his dreams. They discuss the anima and animus. She helps him interpret his visions. Their relationship deepens. Emma sees this and feels pain, but she remains supportive. Carl balances his love for both women as best he can. He writes about the danger of identifying with one aspect of oneself and ignoring the opposite. He feels he is living this tension daily. He begins to articulate the concept of individuation, the process of becoming whole by integrating all aspects of the self. He knows that he cannot reject his own contradictions without harming himself. He embraces complexity, even when it causes discomfort. After the war, Europe is exhausted. Carl feels a responsibility to apply what he has learned. He continues his practice, focusing on helping patients find meaning. He no longer sees symptoms as random or purely sexual. He sees them as messages from the unconscious, calling the person to expand. He encourages patients to engage with their dreams through active imagination. He helps them identify archetypal themes: the hero, the child, the trickster. He watches as they confront their shadows, integrate their anima or animus, and move toward the self. He sees their faces lighten, their bodies relax. He feels honored to witness transformation. He writes about case studies, always protecting anonymity. He teaches students who will become analysts. He insists that analysts must work on themselves as much as on their patients. He says one cannot lead another where one has not been. He begins to travel again. He visits his colleague Richard Wilhelm in Germany, who translates the Chinese text, the I Ching. Carl is fascinated by the idea of synchronicity, meaningful coincidence without causal connection. He uses the I Ching and notices that its readings often match his inner state. He writes about synchronicity as a principle linking inner and outer events. He theorizes that the psyche and matter are connected through a deeper order. He sees parallels in alchemy and quantum physics. Scientists dismiss this, but artists resonate. Carl receives letters from painters, composers, and writers. He collaborates with them, learning that art often anticipates what psychology will later formalize. He begins to feel part of a cultural movement, not just a medical one. At home, he spends more time with his children, who are now adults. He talks with them about their dreams and encourages them to find their own paths. He accepts that they may not share his interests. He is proud of them regardless. He continues to carve stones at Bollingen, adding new symbols. He writes his thoughts on his retreat's walls, inscribing Latin and Greek phrases. He sits by the lake at sunset, watching the light change. He feels grateful for Emma and Tony, for their support and love. He thinks of his father and forgives him for his doubts. He thinks of his mother and thanks her for her visions. He thinks of Freud and feels sadness for their lost friendship. He prays silently, not to a specific deity, but to the self. He thanks the unconscious for guiding him. He closes his eyes and breathes deeply, feeling the peace that comes from integrating shadow and light. The Red Book remains hidden. Only a few close friends know of it. Carl takes it down occasionally to reread passages. He marvels at how his past self wrote things he still strives to understand. He knows the book is not for everyone. It is a personal scripture, a record of his psychic journey. It has taught him that the psyche is alive, that images have agency, and that if one listens, the soul will speak. He will not publish it in his lifetime. He fears it would be misinterpreted or used against him. He entrusts it to his descendants, hoping they will know when the time is right. The book sits on a shelf, bound in red leather, heavy with secrets. It is a reminder that the deepest truths may need to lie dormant until they find fertile soil. Carl shares parts of his journey indirectly. He writes about the process of individuation. He describes stages: encountering the shadow, meeting the anima or animus, confronting archetypes, discovering the self. He explains that the self is not the ego, but a larger center that encompasses all opposites. He writes about the psyche as a mandala. He creates diagrams and calls them mandalas, inspired by similar structures in Tibetan Buddhism. He sees mandalas as expressions of inner order. He believes everyone has an inner mandala, though they may not know it. He teaches students to draw their own circles and watch how patterns emerge. He says, the mandala is a safe refuge, a symbol of wholeness. He also writes about alchemy. He sees alchemical texts as describing psychological processes through images of ovens, metals, and spirits. He studies symbols like the king and queen, the dragon, the phoenix. He interprets the nigredo, blackening, as the despair of depression, the albedo, whitening, as purification, and the rubedo, reddening, as integration. He sees his own journey reflected in these stages. He shares these insights with colleagues, some of whom think he has lost his mind. He smiles and continues. He knows that truth is not always popular. He trusts his inner Philemon more than the critics. He lives with the knowledge that his work may not be fully appreciated until after he is gone. He is content with that. He has seen that life is long and short simultaneously, and that seeds planted now may bloom decades later. Imagine the deep night, when the world sleeps and only the wind moves through trees. In the darkness, Carl lights a candle and sits at his desk, ready to journey inward. He closes his eyes and allows images to arise. He sees himself standing before a cave mouth carved into a mountainside. He feels both fear and curiosity. He steps inside. The air is cool and damp. The darkness wraps around him. He hears water dripping, the distant sound of wings. He walks deeper. A faint light appears ahead. He approaches and sees a vast cavern. Stalagmites rise like pillars. In the center sits an old man with a long beard and wings like a kingfisher. Horns curl from his brow. His eyes are bright, ancient. "I am Philemon," he says. "I am your guide." Carl listens as Philemon speaks in riddles. "Thoughts are like birds," Philemon says. "They have their own life. Do not try to control them. Let them come and go." Carl asks questions. Philemon answers with stories that hint at deeper truths. Time dissolves. When Carl returns to himself, hours have passed. He writes down everything he remembers. He paints Philemon, capturing the blue of his wings, the curl of his horns. He feels that he has met an inner teacher. He will return to Philemon many times. Each visit reveals something new about himself and the world. Sometimes he meets other figures. A dark serpent slithers across his path. He follows it until it transforms into a circle that swallows its tail. He realizes it is an Ouroboros, symbol of eternity. He meets a young woman who introduces herself as his soul. She says her name is Salome. She has long hair and a quiet presence. She holds a lamp and guides him through dark corridors. She shows him scenes of cruelty and kindness, beauty and horror. She says, "I am everything you have not yet loved." He understands that this is his anima, the feminine part of his psyche. He feels humbled. He had thought he knew himself. Now he sees there are depths he has never explored. He thanks her and promises to listen. He writes down her words, treating them as sacred scripture. He feels that each figure he encounters is an aspect of himself, and also a timeless archetype, shared by all. The visions continue. In one, he finds himself on a sea with no shore in sight. He sits in a small boat, waves rocking him gently. The sky above is filled with stars. A voice whispers, "You are sailing on the unconscious. Do not fear the depth." He looks into the water and sees faces. Some are ancient, with carved features. Others are modern. They look up at him, their expressions neutral. He dips his hand in the water. It is cold. Ripples spread outward. He hears a song rising from below, a chorus of voices. The song is familiar, yet he cannot understand the words. He listens. He feels tears streaming down his cheeks. He senses that these are the voices of his ancestors and of all those who came before him. They are telling him that he is not alone, that his struggles are part of a larger story. He whispers back, "Thank you." The sea calms. He feels held. In another vision, he walks through a forest at night. The trees are tall, their branches interlocking to form an archway. Fog clings to the ground. He hears footsteps behind him. He turns and sees a large, shadowy figure. It is his own shadow, enormous, dark, with glowing eyes. He feels fear. He wants to run. But he remembers Philemon's advice, "Face what appears." He stops and turns to the shadow. "Who are you?" he asks. The shadow's voice rumbles like thunder. "I am everything you have rejected." It lists traits: anger, selfishness, lust, envy. Carl feels shame. He realizes he has tried to be good and has denied these parts of himself. The shadow continues, "I am your power too. I am your vitality. Integrate me, or I will overwhelm you." Carl nods. He thanks the shadow. He says, "I will not banish you. I will listen." The shadow shrinks to a manageable size, nods and steps beside him. They walk together. Carl learns that accepting his shadow gives him strength. He writes about this, explaining that the shadow is not evil but unacknowledged energy. He encourages others to turn toward their shadows, to hear what they have to say. Carl's relationship with Toni deepens during this inner work. She becomes a mirror for his anima. She is insightful, intuitive, and fearless in exploring her own psyche. They spend hours discussing dreams, reading alchemical texts, and interpreting visions. She points out patterns he misses. She suggests that the anima can appear in various forms: mother, guide, lover. She helps him differentiate between the personal anima, shaped by his experiences with women, and the archetypal anima, an inner feminine principle. She explains that men project their anima onto women, expecting them to embody everything they have not yet integrated. He realizes he has done this with both Toni and Emma. He apologizes and begins to withdraw projections. Their relationship becomes less about need and more about mutual respect. Toni remains his collaborator. Emma remains his wife and mother of his children. Carl learns to hold the tension of loving two women differently. He sees that love does not obey social rules. He writes, "Love bears all things. It is a mystery." Emma, meanwhile, finds her own path. She studies psychology and becomes an analyst. She writes about marriage and the family, bringing her practical experience to bear. She helps women explore their shadows and animus. She hosts seminars and invites analysts to their home. She and Carl discuss cases. She provides feedback. She sets boundaries when his work threatens to consume him. She insists he spend time with the children, that he go for walks, that he eat his meals. She keeps the household running. She struggles with jealousy and hurt, but does not let them define her. She reads about alchemy and applies it to her own growth. She carves her own stones at Bollingen. She visits the tower alone sometimes, lighting a fire and sitting quietly. She and Carl talk openly about their feelings. They do not pretend. Their marriage becomes a crucible for individuation. It is not perfect, but it is authentic. Through his visions, his work with patients, and his collaborations with Toni and Emma, Carl formulates the concept of archetypes more clearly. He identifies several: the mother, the child, the hero, the wise old man, the trickster, the shadow, the anima and animus, and the self. He explains that archetypes are universal patterns of behavior and imagery that reside in the collective unconscious. They are not literal figures, but potentials that shape how we experience the world. He writes that each person must face their archetypes if they are to become whole. He recognizes that the archetypes can manifest in dreams, myths, art, and relationships. He sees, for example, the wise old man archetype in Philemon, the trickster in the playful aspects of his personality, and the hero in his patience, struggles. He emphasizes that archetypes are neither good nor bad. They are neutral energies that must be integrated consciously. He believes that ignoring an archetype results in projection onto others, causing misunderstanding. He also writes about the self. He calls it the archetype of order and the goal of individuation. The self holds opposites together, reconciling light and dark, feminine and masculine, personal and collective. It appears in dreams as a mandala, a jewel, a wise figure, or a divine child. He sees the self as both a psychological and a spiritual concept. He differentiates it from the ego, which is the center of consciousness. He explains that the ego must serve the self, not the other way around. He teaches that individuation involves a series of confrontations with the unconscious, each bringing the ego closer to the self. He explains that this process is lifelong, and that no one reaches perfect integration. The goal is not perfection, but wholeness, the ability to hold contradictions without being torn apart. His students find this both liberating and daunting. He encourages them to trust their own process and to keep a journal of dreams. He says, "Your psyche will show you the way." The tower at Bollingen becomes Carl's laboratory for integrating his inner and outer worlds. He builds it by hand, hauling stones from the lake shore, mixing mortar, and fitting each piece meticulously. The first tower has a circular room with a fireplace, a small kitchen, and a bed. Later he adds a second tower, then a third, creating a small courtyard. Each addition corresponds to a stage in his life. He carves inscriptions above the doorways. Vocations atque non vocatus Deus aderit. Called or not, God will be there. He paints mandalas on the walls. He inscribes quotes in Latin and Greek. He carves the names of his ancestors and inscriptions from the I Ching. He sees the tower as a manifestation of his psyche. The stones are his bones, the mortar his blood, the spiral staircase his spine. When he lights a fire, he imagines it is the warmth of his heart. He cooks simple meals on the hearth. He draws water from the well. He lives without electricity or plumbing. He feels connected to the earth and to those who lived in stone houses long ago. He senses the ancestors smiling. He invites friends to visit. They sit by the fire, drink wine, and talk about dreams until late. The tower becomes a place of hospitality and introspection. While working on the tower, he continues to travel. He visits the United States again, giving lectures in New York and Berkeley. He meets Native Americans and talks with them about their rituals. He is invited to ceremonies and listens to stories about the Earth Mother and Spider Grandmother. He sees parallels between their myths and the archetypes he has identified. He returns to Zurich and writes about the psychological importance of ritual. He argues that modern people have lost rituals that connect them to the unconscious, and he advocates for creating new ones. He suggests that therapy can serve as a ritual space. He designs exercises for patients, such as drawing mandalas or building stone cairns. He sees that when people create symbolic objects, they integrate unacknowledged parts of themselves. He continues to work with patients, always linking their personal journey to the collective human story. Carl studies alchemical texts with renewed passion. He buys volumes in German, Latin, and French. He works with translations. He draws illustrations from these books and compares them to his own visions. He writes that alchemists projected their inner processes onto matter. The stages of alchemy mirror the stages of individuation. The blackening stage corresponds to confronting the shadow. The whitening corresponds to purification and insight. The reddening corresponds to integrating opposites and achieving the self. He writes that alchemists use terms like soul, sun, and luna, moon, to signify masculine and feminine principles. He connects these to anima and animus. He finds parallels between the hermaphrodite figure in alchemy and the union of opposites in psychology. He sees that alchemy is a symbolic language for inner transformation. He shares these insights with a small circle of colleagues. Father Victor White, a Dominican priest, becomes one of his correspondents. They discuss the relationship between psychology and theology. They debate the nature of evil. Carl feels that his ideas are being taken seriously by at least some in the religious community. He is grateful for this dialogue. He also writes about the quaternity, the number 4 symbolizing wholeness. He notes that many myths and religious systems organize reality in 4s, 4 elements, 4 directions, 4 stages. He draws mandalas, divided into 4 quadrants. He explains that the quaternity reflects the self because it contains completeness. He applies this to his personality typology. He suggests that thinking, feeling, sensation and intuition form a quaternity. He encourages people to develop their inferior function, the one least used, as a way to move toward wholeness. He sees that his own inferior function is sensation, and he works to engage with his body and the material world. He writes, "To become whole, one must accept the inferior as equal to the superior." He continues to pick up stones and carve them. He gardens, he cooks, he chops wood. These acts ground his thinking. He smiles as he writes. Chopping wood is a form of meditation. Carl travels to East Africa as part of the Bugishu expedition. The journey is long, taking him by train and ship. He feels both excitement and trepidation. He writes in his journal, "I go to Africa to see if my psychological types apply beyond Europe." In Kenya and Uganda, he meets the Elgonyai people. He stands on the slopes of Mount Elgon, the ground red and rich, the air full of bird calls. He watches their rituals, observes how they live close to nature. He listens to their stories. He learns that they believe the life force flows through everything, that they are connected to ancestors and animals. He senses a kinship between their beliefs and his own idea of the collective unconscious. He feels validated that archetypes are not Western constructs but human. He also notes that they have rituals for transitions, birth, adolescence, marriage, death. He sees that these rituals help individuals navigate psychological changes. He returns home convinced that modern people need rituals too. He writes about the kinship libido, the instinct that binds a community together. He compares it to Ubuntu in African philosophy. I am because we are. He writes, "Modern Westerners suffer because they have lost the sense that their lives are part of a greater whole." Next, he travels to India. He arrives in Calcutta, overwhelmed by the heat, the smells of spices and incense, the noise of traffic and animals. He visits temples with towering gopurams, adorned with sculptures of deities. He speaks with scholars about Hindu and Buddhist philosophies. He learns about Atman and Brahman, the individual soul and the universal soul. He sees similarities with his concept of the self. He visits the holy city of Benares and watches devotees bathing in the Ganges. He feels a sense of timelessness. He meets with the scholar Heinrich Zimmer, who explains the symbolism in Indian myths. Carl takes notes fervently. He falls ill with dysentery and is confined to bed. In fever dreams, he sees mandalas of spinning wheels within wheels. He sees images of burning temples and crossing rivers. He writes these visions down once recovered. He reflects on how Indian thought integrates opposites. He returns to Switzerland with a deeper appreciation for Eastern wisdom. He writes, "The East knows what the West forgets, that the outer and inner worlds are one." In New Mexico, Carl visits the Pueblo people. He meets Chief Mountain Lake, who invites him to participate in a ceremony. They stand in a kiva, a subterranean ceremonial space. The walls are decorated with paintings of the cosmos. Carl listens as Mountain Lake explains their cosmology, that the tribe performs rituals each day to ensure the sun rises. Without their prayers, the cosmic order would collapse. Carl is moved by this sense of responsibility. He contrasts it with the Western belief that the sun rises because of physical laws. He writes about this encounter, saying that modern people have lost their connection to cosmic responsibility. He notes that the Pueblo see themselves as co-creators of reality. He writes, "We have lost the ability to imagine that our actions matter on a cosmic scale. We have shrunk our world." He returns home with a new understanding of how myth and ritual maintain psychological balance. Back in Switzerland, Carl incorporates what he has learned. He writes essays for a broader audience. He distills his ideas into accessible language. He writes about synchronicity, citing examples from the I Ching, and his patience. He explains that events can be meaningfully connected without physical causation. He writes about flying saucers, interpreting them as modern symbols of the self, round, luminous, appearing in the sky. He receives letters from people who have seen lights and spheres. Some think they are aliens. Carl thinks they are projections of psychic wholeness. He writes, "When humanity needs a symbol, the heavens provide one." He continues to work at the tower. He adds a fourth wing representing the quaternity. He carves a serpent, devouring its own tail into a stone. He writes, "No tree can reach to heaven unless its roots go down to hell." He reflects on his own roots, his family's pastors, his father's doubts, his mother's visions. He thanks them all. The desert stretches before you, vast and golden, the air shimmering with heat. Carl stands at the edge of the Sahara, the sand beneath his boots soft and warm. He squints against the bright light and feels the hot wind brush his face. He has come to Africa to learn from its people and its landscape. He walks with local guides, their footsteps silent on the dunes. They stop under acacia trees and share stories. Carl listens as an elder speaks of ancestors who live in stones and trees. He remembers his own childhood stones and feels a kinship. He visits small villages where people gather under the stars to tell stories. He hears tales of lions and spirits, of courage and cunning. He realizes that the themes in these stories mirror those of Greek myths. He sees that the hero's journey is universal. He feels humbled by the realization that the collective unconscious is truly collective. As he travels deeper into the Sahara, he experiences the vastness of silence. There are no houses, no cars, just sand, sky, and wind. At night, the stars blaze in an unpolluted sky. He lies on his back and feels as if he is floating in space. The constellations seem closer. He listens to the wind whisper across the dunes. He thinks of the voice of Philemon, of ancestral whispers. He feels the desert stripping away his ideas and leaving him with only the essentials: breath, heartbeat, awareness. He hears his own thoughts more clearly. He writes in his journal, "The desert is the unconscious laid bare. Its emptiness is full." He draws mandalas in the sand, watching the wind erase them. He learns about impermanence. He returns to Europe changed, carrying grains of sand in his shoes and a sense of vastness in his heart. In India, Carl walks through ancient temples, their stone walls cool under his fingertips. He traces carvings of gods and goddesses and feels the weight of centuries. He hears chants in Sanskrit and smells incense. He sits under a banyan tree and listens to a Swami talk about Maya, the illusion of the material world. He hears about the cycle of birth and rebirth. He learns that the goal is to realize unity with the divine. He connects this to his concept of individuation. He sees that both paths aim toward wholeness. He writes that the Western psyche is more concerned with individuality, while the Eastern psyche emphasizes unity. He thinks about how to balance these. He meets scholars who discuss the Upanishads. He hears about the lotus arising from the mud, a symbol of the self. He draws lotuses in his notebook and compares them to mandalas. He sits by the Ganges and watches people perform rituals. He feels the sacredness of water. He reflects on how his childhood lake shaped him. He writes, "Water remembers, stones remember, so do we." In Calcutta he falls ill. Fever and diarrhea keep him confined. He lies in bed, delirious, and dreams of temples burning, of snakes coiled around trees, of women dancing in circles. He wakes, drenched in sweat, and writes down the images. He recovers slowly, drinking mango lassi and listening to street sounds. He feels vulnerable and grateful. He realizes that his body limits him even as his mind seeks infinity. He returns to Switzerland with a deeper respect for the body. He writes about the importance of sensation. He acknowledges his inferior function. He tends to his garden with more care. Carl's trip to the American Southwest introduces him to the Pueblo people. He meets Chief Mountain Lake, a tall man with thoughtful eyes. They sit together under a big sky, the horizon stretching in every direction. Mountain Lake explains that his tribe dances to ensure the sun rises. Without their dance, the sun might forget. Carl is intrigued by the sense of cosmic responsibility. He thinks about how Western people take sunrise for granted. He watches the Pueblo men and women dance, their feet pounding rhythmically, dust rising. He feels the ground shake. He senses that the dance ties the community to the cosmos, aligning inner and outer rhythms. He writes that modern people need rituals that connect them to something greater than themselves. He compares the sun dance to Christian Mass and to psychological work. He sees that all three are forms of communion. He writes, "We are all dancers in the cosmic dance. Without us, the dance is incomplete." He also travels to Taos Pueblo and hears the story of Blue Lake, a sacred body of water. The government once seized the land, but the Pueblo fought to have it returned. Carl hears how the Pueblo see themselves as guardians of the lake. He feels a resonance with his own care for Lake Zurich. He writes about the importance of place. He says that each person has a psychological homeland, a place that holds their memories and dreams. For him, it is the lake of his childhood and the tower at Bollingen. For the Pueblo, it is Blue Lake. He encourages people to reconnect with their landscapes, to find sacredness in the earth under their feet. He sees that the psyche is not separate from nature. He writes, "We are not in nature. We are nature." He returns to Switzerland carrying turquoise stones gifted by the Pueblo. He places them on his desk alongside his fossils. As Carl ages, he spends more time at Bollingen. He adds another wing to the tower, creating an inner courtyard enclosed by walls. He grows vegetables and herbs. He chops wood and carries water. He writes in his journal by the fireplace. He invites theologians, artists, and analysts to visit. They sit on stone benches and talk about dreams and alchemy. He listens as young psychologists share their own visions. He offers advice sparingly, encouraging them to trust their own experiences. He writes letters to Father Victor White about the nature of evil. He argues that evil is a real force, not just an absence of good. He debates with White about the role of God in psychology. Their correspondence is rich and challenging. Carl appreciates having a friend who can engage with him on spiritual matters. He feels that psychology and theology must dialogue. He hopes for a future where they work together to heal souls. He continues to publish. In 1944, he writes Psychology and Alchemy, describing the parallels between alchemical symbolism and psychological transformation. He writes about Mysterium Conjunctionis, exploring the union of opposites. He receives honorary degrees from universities. He travels to London and speaks at the Tavistock Clinic. He lectures at the Eranos conferences in Ascona, sharing his latest ideas with an audience of scholars and seekers. He is photographed, interviewed, and quoted. He becomes a figure of interest beyond psychology, admired by artists and writers. He is careful not to become a guru. He often repeats, "I am not a prophet. I am a medical man." He insists that each person must find their own path. He resists being placed on a pedestal. He knows that idols fall. Life brings sorrow as well as joy. In 1955, Emma dies after a short illness. Carl is devastated. They had shared more than 50 years, raised 5 children, and navigated complex relationships. She had been his anchor, his partner, his challenger. He stands by her grave, tears streaming down his face. He feels part of himself die with her. He carves her name into a stone at Bollingen and places it near the water. He writes, "Emma, my dear, my love, you have gone ahead. I will follow when my time comes." He spends long hours in the tower, thinking of her. He listens to the wind blowing through the courtyard. He sees her in his dreams, smiling and free. He feels grateful for their life together. He continues to correspond with Tony, who remains a friend and colleague. Their relationship shifts after Emma's death. It becomes quieter, more contemplative. They talk of aging, of what awaits beyond death. Carl writes about the need to live one's own myth until the end. He continues to plant seeds, literally and figuratively, knowing he may not see them sprout. He suffers a heart attack in 1944 and nearly dies. During his near-death experience, he finds himself high above the earth, looking down at a globe of shimmering blue and green. He feels peace and contentment. He does not want to return. A voice tells him his time is not yet. He wakes in his bed, disappointed and grateful. He writes about the experience, describing it as a glimpse of the beyond. He notes that death is not to be feared but embraced, as part of a larger cycle. He continues to work but slows down. He takes naps in the afternoon, sits in the garden, and watches the light change. He writes letters to his grandchildren. He tells them stories about stones and keys. He encourages them to follow their dreams. He receives visitors from around the world, young people seeking wisdom. He smiles at their enthusiasm and warns them not to imitate him. He says, "Do not become me, become yourself." During these years, Carl also becomes a popular public figure. In 1957, the BBC interviews him for television. He sits in a chair, hair white, eyes bright, and answers questions about God, death, and dreams. His voice is gentle, measured. He emphasizes that the psyche is real, that God is a psychological fact, and that anyone who ignores the unconscious does so at their peril. The interviewer asks if he believes in God. He replies, "I do not believe. I know." The interview becomes famous. People debate his words. Some call him arrogant. Others find comfort. He writes articles for general audiences, trying to make complex ideas accessible. He collaborates with Aldous Huxley and Lawrence Vanderpost. He appears in magazines and newspapers. He becomes a household name. He receives letters from people who say his words saved their lives. He reads them with humility. He writes back, when he can, encouraging them to trust their dreams. He knows that fame is fleeting. He keeps chopping wood. At the same time, he mentors younger analysts. He hosts seminars in his house. He listens to case reports. He offers guidance. He tells stories from his own life, not to brag but to illustrate principles. He speaks about the importance of living with uncertainty, of holding contradictions. He warns against rigid ideologies. He encourages creativity. He says, "You must remain curious. When curiosity dies, the soul dies." He watches as his students develop their own approaches. He is proud when they diverge from him. He smiles when they call him professor. He sometimes reminds them to call him doctor instead. He knows titles do not define a person. He takes satisfaction in watching the seeds he planted grow in others' gardens. He knows that his work will continue through them, not as dogma, but as living ideas. As Carl nears the end of his life, he spends more time in reflection. He sits by the lake, watching its surface change with wind and light. He looks at the mountains and remembers climbing them as a young man. He thinks of his children and grandchildren, of the joys and sorrows they have brought. He thinks of his patients, their courage, their pain. He thinks of Freud, of the passion and the break. He sends forgiveness into the air. He thinks of Emma and Tony, of love's complexity. He prays for them both, though Emma is gone and Tony far away. He thinks of Philemon and Salome, of snakes and mandalas. He smiles. He whispers, "It was worth it." He feels ready. One night in June 1961, he feels a heaviness in his chest. He lies down in his bed. A nurse sits by his side. He whispers that he sees light. He smiles and says, "This is beautiful." He closes his eyes and takes a final breath. He is 85. His family gathers. They cry and hold each other. They light a candle in the tower at Bollingen. They place flowers by the stone with Emma's name. They place a new stone for Carl beside hers. The lake is calm, reflecting clouds. The tower stands, its stones weathered and strong. Inside, the fire crackles. Carl's notebooks sit on a shelf. The red book is locked away. His pipe rests on the table. His carved stones lie in a bowl. His spirit is gone, but something lingers. A sense of presence, a whisper in the wind. Those who visit Bollingen speak of feeling him there, especially by the water at dusk. After his death, his ideas spread. Analysts around the world build on his work. Some focus on dreams, others integrate mythology into therapy. Artists read his writings and create sculptures and paintings. Writers weave his concepts into novels. People who never enter therapy read about archetypes and recognize themselves. Books like Man and His Symbols bring his ideas to the public. The Red Book remains unpublished, hidden in a bank vault, but its aura grows. Scholars speculate about its contents. Some call it his gospel. Decades later, it will be released, and people will marvel at its calligraphy and paintings. They will see the roots of his theories and feel humbled by his courage. For now, they read his published works, his essays, and his memoir, Memories, Dreams, Reflections. They see how he wove his life into his theories. They realize that to study Jung is to study a life lived in search of wholeness. The tower at Bollingen becomes a pilgrimage site. Visitors come to see the stones he carved, the mandalas on the walls, the inscriptions. They sit on the bench where he sat and listen to the wind. They skip stones on the lake, imagining ripples spreading. They hold their hands over the carved motto, "Called or not, God will be present." They feel the truth in those words. Some leave notes in crevices, asking for guidance. Others sit in silence. Everyone leaves with a feeling of peace. They sense that the tower is not just a building but a symbol of one man's journey to integrate his shadow and his light. They look at the stones and think of his hands placing them, of his breath mixing mortar, of his heart beating as he lifted each one. They feel inspired to build their own towers, literal or symbolic. They realize that each person can create a space where the conscious and unconscious meet. The story draws to a close in the gentle light of evening. You sit by a lake, the same lake that saw a child collect stones and a man build a tower. The water is calm, its surface smooth like glass. The sky above is streaked with orange and pink. The air is cool. You feel the weight of the story you have walked through. The birth of a boy, the doubts of a father, the visions of a mother, the complexity of love, the pain of friendship lost, the depth of inner journeys, the vastness of deserts and oceans. the strength of towers built by hand. You feel a sense of kinship with Carl Jung, though you have never met him. You see that his questions are your questions. Who am I? What lies hidden in me? How do I integrate my darkness? What do my dreams say? How can I become whole? You remember his belief that each person carries a shadow. You think about your own shadow, the parts of you that feel shameful or frightening. You imagine turning toward them, listening to what they have to say. You remember his words about the anima and animus. You wonder what inner figures you have ignored. You picture inviting them to sit by the fire in your mind. You remember his description of the self as a center that holds opposites. You imagine a circle within you, a mandala. You sense that it is alive, that it longs to be known. You recall his idea of synchronicity. You think of coincidences in your own life that felt meaningful. You consider that maybe there is an order connecting your inner world to the outer world. You feel less alone. You think about stones. You see them in your mind's eye. Smooth river rocks, jagged mountain stones, carved tower blocks, tiny fossils. You remember how stones held meaning for Carl throughout his life. They were his first friends, his hidden totems, his building materials. You consider what objects hold meaning for you. Perhaps there is a shell on a windowsill, or a photo in a locket. You imagine picking it up, feeling its weight, listening to what it might say. You think about keys, like the one Carl carried from his grandfather. You wonder what keys you have inherited, literal or metaphorical. You think about what doors you might open. You feel a sense of possibility. You also think about water. It appears again and again in his story. Lake Constance, the Rhine, the sea, the Ganges, the Blue Lake. Water reflects, cleanses, and carries. It is deep and changeable. It flows, just as life flows. You imagine sitting by water, watching reflections. You imagine letting your thoughts drift like leaves on a stream. You feel your body relax. You hear the hush of waves. You breathe in and out, feeling the rhythm. You imagine this story as a river you have floated down. You have seen rapids and calm stretches, dark depths and bright surfaces. Now you near the mouth, where the river meets the sea of sleep. You feel grateful. You feel ready to let go. In these final moments, you remember that Jung often ended his letters with the phrase, vocatus atque non vocatus Deus adderate. Called or not, God will be present. You interpret God as whatever holds the world together, a force, a mystery, a self. You realize that whether or not you call to it, it is present in your dreams, in your symbols, in your life. You smile gently. You feel your eyelids grow heavy. You imagine Carl sitting by his tower, smoothing his hand over a carved stone, looking at the lake. You imagine him turning to you and nodding, as if to say, "You have your own journey. Trust it. Listen to your dreams. Walk toward the darkness with curiosity, and you will find light." You breathe once more, long and slow. The story fades like the last light on the water. The world softens. You drift into sleep.